The night went silent so suddenly it felt like the world had blinked and forgotten to start breathing again. I remember gripping the steering wheel of my old Volkswagen RV even though the engine was off, my knuckles tight, listening to that silence press in from all sides. Swamps aren't supposed to go quiet. Not like that. Not all at once. The frogs had been screaming moments earlier, layered croaks and clicks echoing through the cypress like a living heartbeat. And then without warning, they stopped, as if something had stepped into the water and every living thing had decided not to be noticed. My name came next. Slow. Drawn out. Wrong. Eli, it croaked, deep and wet, like the sound had to push its way through mud before it reached my ears. I was 34 years old then, born and raised in central Georgia, the kind of guy who trusted maps, instincts, and solitude more than people. I'd been RV camping for nearly a decade, long enough to know that fear usually arrives wearing ordinary clothes. A strange noise, a bad feeling, a moment where the math stops adding up. But I'd never heard the wilderness say my name before. I'd driven my Volkswagen down into Big Cypress that afternoon, chasing heat and isolation, telling myself I needed the space. The breakup was still fresh, the kind that leaves echoes in your head even when you're alone. I told friends I wanted quiet. What I really wanted was to stop hearing my own thoughts. Big Cypress doesn't offer that kind of mercy. By nightfall, the humidity wrapped around my RV like a second skin. Even with the windows cracked, the air inside felt thick enough to chew. The swamp breathed. You could feel it. Warm, damp exhalations rolling in waves through the trees. The smell was rot and life tangled together. Decaying leaves, stagnant water, something sweet underneath that made my stomach tighten without explanation. I parked at a dispersed campsite just off a narrow access road, nothing but a small clearing and water on three sides. No other RVs, no lanterns in the distance, just my Volkswagen, the dark, and the sound of things moving where I couldn't see them, at least until the frogs stopped. When my name came out of the dark, my first reaction wasn't terror. It was denial. The brain clings to logic the way a drowning man clings to air. You're tired, you're half asleep, your mind is filling in shapes. I laughed under my breath, a short, nervous sound, and shook my head. The laugh died fast. The silence didn't. Eli, the voice croaked again, closer this time. Not loud, not aggressive, just present, like it had learned the sound and was testing it. I should have stayed quiet. I know that now. But humans are wired to respond to their names. It's a reflex deeper than reason. Yeah, I said, my voice thin in the open air. The moment the word left my mouth, regret hit me like cold water. Something answered back immediately. A ripple moved through the swamp, not the kind made by fish or gators slipping under. This was wide, heavy. The water parted without splashing, like whatever was moving knew how sound traveled and didn't want to be heard. I stepped back toward the RV, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The ground here never fully dries. It gives under your weight, reminding you that everything solid is temporary. I told myself it was a trick of acoustics. That sound carries strangely over water, that someone else might be camping nearby, messing with me. But the logic felt fragile, like glass already cracked. I climbed into the RV and closed the door, the metal thud louder than I wanted. Inside, the familiar smells of old upholstery and motor oil grounded me for half a second. I locked the door. Then the deadbolt. Then I stood there, listening. The swamp answered with movement. Something brushed against the water just beyond the tree line, slow and deliberate. No splashes, no thrashing, just displacement. The frog stayed silent like an audience holding its breath. I turned off the lantern. Darkness swallowed the interior instantly, broken only by faint moonlight slipping through the curtains. My reflection stared back at me in the window glass, eyes wide, jaw tight, someone I barely recognized. Eli, it croaked again. This time, it sounded closer to the RV than the water's edge should have allowed. My heart started to pound, hard enough that I worried it might give me away. I held my breath, counting the seconds between sounds. The air inside felt warmer now, pressing against my skin, sweat gathering at my lower back. I thought about starting the engine, about leaving everything behind and driving until sunrise. But big Cypress roads aren't forgiving at night. Narrow, unmarked. One wrong turn and you're axle deep in water with no cell signal and no help coming. The voice changed. It tried my name again, then something else. Sounds that weren't words, but felt like attempts at them. The rhythm was off, like a song learned wrong. The smell reached me next. Not the usual swamp rot, but something sharper, coppery, like wet pennies and decay layered together. It seeped through the RV's vents, faint but unmistakable, making the back of my throat tighten. I crouched by the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. The water near my campsite was moving now, forming a slow, widening V as something large pushed through it. Moonlight glinted off a surface that didn't reflect the way skin or scales should. It looked matte, absorbing light instead of throwing it back. I felt my mind scrambling for labels. Alligator, manatee, fallen log, none of them fit. The thing stopped just short of the tree line. The water settled around it, smooth as glass. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the croak came again, right outside the RV. Eli. It wasn't calling anymore. It was waiting. My chest burned from shallow breathing. I thought about the mistakes that had led me here, the times I'd ignored bad feelings, the way I'd convinced myself that solitude meant safety. The swamp didn't care about my reasons. It didn't care about my past. It only cared that I'd answered. A shape shifted near the door, blocking the moonlight completely. I couldn't see details, just mass, height, a presence that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The RV rocked once, gently, like a hand testing weight. I bit down on my fist to keep from making a sound. The rocking stopped. Something scraped along the metal side of the Volkswagen, slow and exploratory, producing a sound like thick nails dragged across rust. The vibration traveled through the floor into my knees, into my bones. My mind raced through options, none of them good. The smell intensified. The scraping moved toward the front of the RV, toward the driver's door. And then I heard the handle shift, just slightly, as if something outside was learning how it worked. The handle didn't turn all the way. It just shifted, testing resistance, learning limits. Metal clicked softly, the smallest sound in the world, but in that moment it was louder than a gunshot. I pressed my back against the kitchenette counter, my palms slick with sweat, every muscle locked tight as if stillness alone might make me invisible. Outside, the swamp exhaled. Not wind, not breath exactly. It was more like pressure releasing, a low, wet sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The frogs still hadn't returned. Even the insects were gone, leaving a silence so complete it rang in my ears. I realized then that the fear wasn't sharp anymore. It had gone heavy, thick, settled deep in my chest like a stone. The handle moved again, this time a fraction more. I whispered to myself without meaning to, a reflex born from childhood nights when fear needed an audience. Please don't. The moment the words left my mouth, the shape outside reacted. It leaned closer to the door. I felt it in the air, a pressure change that made my ears pop slightly. The smell surged. Copper, rot, something animal but wrong, like a carcass that had learned to walk. Ely, it croaked again. But now there was something new layered into the sound. Impatience. I realized with a sick clarity that it wasn't mimicking me randomly anymore. It was responding, adjusting. Every sound I made gave it more material to work with. Every breath, every whisper, every mistake. I slid sideways toward the driver's seat as quietly as I could, keeping my eyes fixed on the door. The floor creaked under my weight, just a little, and the scraping outside stopped instantly. The silence snapped back into place. My heartbeat thundered in my skull. I waited for movement, for sound, for anything. Nothing. That was worse. I reached the driver's seat and sat down slowly, praying the springs wouldn't squeal. My hand hovered over the ignition. If I turned the key, the engine would roar to life, headlights flooding the clearing. Light meant exposure. Noise meant challenge. But staying meant waiting. Something tapped the window beside me. Not hard, not aggressive, just one slow knock, then another. Knock. Pause. Knock. The rhythm was wrong. Too deliberate. like someone who had seen knocking before but didn't understand why it was done that way. I stared straight ahead, my eyes burning, afraid that if I looked directly at the window I'd see something I couldn't unsee. The glass fogged slightly from my breath, and in that blur I thought I saw movement, an outline shifting closer, stretching upward. The tapping moved higher on the glass. Then came a new sound, one that made my stomach drop. It tried my voice again, not my name this time, my tone. "Yeah?" It croaked, copying me. The word warped and slowed as if dragged through water before being shaped into sound. Panic flared hot and sudden, burning through the heavy dread. My instincts screamed at me to run, to break the spell of stillness before it settled completely. I turned the key. The engine coughed once. The knocking stopped. For a half-second, hope flared. Then the RV rocked violently to one side. I slammed my foot on the brake as the engine caught, headlights bursting through the darkness. The clearing lit up in harsh white beams, shadows snapping into place like broken teeth. And there it was, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, half in water, half on land. It was tall, too tall. Its body was thick and sloped, like something built for moving through resistance, through mud and water and time. The surface of it wasn't skin the way I understood skin. It looked layered, uneven, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Its head tilted slightly, not like an animal, but like someone trying to understand an unfamiliar object. Where its face should have been, there was suggestion rather than detail. Hollows where eyes might be, a wide, slack shape that could almost pass for a mouth if you didn't look too long. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The thing took a step forward. The water didn't splash. It parted around its leg and closed again silently, like it was being welcomed. I slammed the RV into gear and hit the gas. The tires spun, mud spraying uselessly as the RV fishtailed. For a terrifying second, I thought I'd bogged down completely. The headlights jerked wildly, illuminating twisted cypress knees and hanging moss that looked like reaching arms. The thing didn't chase. It didn't need to. It simply lifted its head and croaked again, this time stringing sounds together, almost forming a sentence. Almost. The RV lurched free with a violent jolt, snapping me forward in my seat. I wrestled the wheel, following the faint outline of the access road as it curved away from the clearing. Branches scraped the sides, the sound like claws dragging along metal. In the rearview mirror, I saw it step fully onto land. It moved wrong. Not fast, not slow, just wrong. Each step seemed delayed, as if the ground had to remember how to support it. I didn't stop driving until my hands cramped around the wheel and my vision blurred with tears I hadn't realized were falling. The road felt endless, the swamp pressing in on both sides, shadows stretching and shifting at the edges of the headlights. Even when the frogs returned, sudden, explosive noise flooding the night, I didn't feel relief. Because underneath their calls, faint but persistent, I heard something else, a deeper croak, keeping pace. I drove until the road widened and the trees thinned, until I saw another RV in the distance with a single porch light glowing like a promise. I pulled in hard and parked, engine still running, lights blazing. The sounds stopped immediately. I stayed in that seat until dawn, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. When the sun finally rose, Big Cypress looked ordinary again, beautiful even. Mist curled over the water. Birds picked through the shallows. Nothing looked out of place. But I was changed. I left the preserve that morning and didn't look back. I've camped since then, plenty of times, but never in swamps, never where water can hide movement, never where silence can fall all at once. I learned something that night, something I carry with me every time I park my RV and turn off the engine. The wild doesn't need to attack you to claim you. Sometimes it just listens, learns your voice, and waits for you to answer. I thought daylight would end it. That's what I told myself as the sky slowly bruised from black to deep blue, then to gray. I stayed parked beside that other RV, close enough to feel less alone, but not brave enough to knock on a stranger's door. I watched the swamp retreat into something recognizable. Trees becoming trees again, water becoming water, shadows losing their intention. But fear doesn't leave when the sun comes up. It settles in. When I finally stepped out of my Volkswagen, my legs shook so badly I had to lean against the door. The air smelled cleaner now, stripped of that copper rot, but my body still reacted like the threat was standing inches away. Every sound made me flinch. Every ripple in the water pulled my eyes toward it. I checked the RV for damage. Mud caked the tires. Long streaks scraped along the metal siding, deeper than branches should have made. Parallel marks. Deliberate. I didn't touch them. Touching felt like acknowledgement. I drove out of Big Cypress with the windows down, trying to let the wind scrub the night out of my lungs. The road felt unreal, like a memory I hadn't earned yet. Gas stations appeared. Cell service bars flickered back to life on my phone. Normal things. Safe things. And still, every time I stopped at a red light, I swore I could hear it under the hum of engines and tires, that deeper croak, keeping time. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not fully. I gave a sanitized version when people asked why I cut the trip short. Bad weather, bad feeling, didn't sleep well. They nodded, satisfied. People like explanations that fit neatly into their world. The truth didn't. Weeks passed, then months. I camped again, slowly, carefully, choosing places with dry ground and wide sightlines. Deserts, mountains. Anywhere the land stayed honest about what lived on it. I told myself I was fine, but something had shifted inside me. I started waking up at night, heart racing, convinced I'd heard my name whispered just outside whatever thin wall separated me from the dark. Sometimes it was the wind, sometimes an animal, sometimes nothing at all. Once in a rest stop in Alabama, I heard it clearly. Eli. Soft. Curious. I bolted upright in the driver's seat, hands shaking, staring out into the empty lot. Nothing moved. No shadows stretched wrong. No water to hide displacement. Still, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I began to understand that the fear wasn't just about what I'd seen. It was about what I'd done. I'd answered. There's a quiet arrogance we carry into wild places. The belief that curiosity is harmless, that everything unknown wants to be known. That night in Big Cypress stripped that illusion away. Some things don't want conversation, they want recognition, and recognition is a kind of invitation. I did research I never wanted to do. Old ranger logs, local folklore buried in forums and half-forgotten books, stories that never made it into brochures, mentions of sounds traveling without source, of names called across water, of campers who felt watched, followed, learned. Most of the stories ended the same way. The smart ones left. The unlucky ones stayed long enough to answer twice. What haunted me most wasn't the creature itself, but how quickly it adapted, how fast it moved from mimicry to intent, from calling to waiting. It didn't rush. It didn't force the door. It learned. That realization crawled into my thoughts and made a home there. Every time I spoke out loud when I was alone, a small part of me wondered who might be listening, not in paranoia, something quieter, more rational. A recalibration of trust. The world is bigger than we are, deeper, older, and not everything in it is asleep. A year after Big Cypress, I drove past the turnoff again by accident. Same road, same stretch of green swallowing the horizon. I felt it before I saw it, the way my chest tightened, the way my hands locked around the wheel. I didn't slow down, but as I passed, just for a second, the frogs stopped. Not all at once like before. This time it was staggered, like a wave pulling back. I kept my eyes forward, jaw clenched, telling myself it meant nothing. Then, faint and distant, carried across water I couldn't see, I heard it. Not my name, a sound like someone clearing their throat. Testing. I drove until my hands ached and my shoulders burned. I didn't camp that night. I didn't even pull over. I kept going until the sky lightened and the world felt solid again. Here's what I know now, what that swamp taught me in a language I didn't want to learn. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it waits for you to speak first. When you're RV camping, when you're alone with the land and the night presses close, pay attention to silence. Respect it. Let it exist without trying to fill it with your voice, because the wilderness listens. And some places, some ancient, breathing, watchful places, remember the sound of you long after you've gone. I still camp. I still love the road. I still believe there's healing in solitude. But when the frogs stop now, when the night holds its breath, I do the one thing that might have saved me back then. I stay quiet. Silence changes after something answers you. That's the part no one tells you. Before Big Cypress, silence felt empty, neutral, something you could pour yourself into and rest. After that night, silence became shaped, intentional, like a held breath that wasn't yours. I didn't realize how deep it went until years later, parked at a quiet RV campground in northern Arizona, miles from water, miles from anything that could croak my name. The desert was cold, the stars sharp enough to cut. I should have felt safe. Instead, I caught myself whispering apologies into the dark. Not prayers, not pleas, apologies. I understood then that fear had rewired something fundamental in me. Not panic. Panic fades. This was awareness, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that settles into your bones and quietly changes how you move through the world. Because the truth I never said out loud was this: I didn't believe it was confined to the swamp. Big Cypress wasn't the monster, it was the classroom. What followed me wasn't a body or a shape. It was the knowledge that there are intelligences in wild places that don't need eyes to see you or mouths to speak to you. They learn patterns. They learn sound. They learn behavior. They learn names. For a long time, I avoided thinking about that final moment before I escaped. The way it didn't rush me, the way it stood there and watched as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. That restraint haunted me more than aggression ever could have. Predators that hurry are hungry. Predators that wait are confident. I started keeping my voice low when I camped, even around other people. I stopped using Bluetooth speakers, stopped whistling, stopped talking to myself. Friends joked about it, said I was turning into a ghost. They weren't wrong. Once, at a crowded campground in Tennessee, a kid ran past my RV calling his dad's name over and over. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing strangely off the hills. I felt my stomach tighten, that same old pressure behind my eyes. The father answered immediately. Nothing happened. Life went on. But I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, wondering how many times we tempt things without ever knowing it. How often we get away with it and mistake luck for safety. The mind wants closure. It wants to believe that because I drove away, because I survived, the story ended cleanly. It didn't. Stories like this don't end. They go quiet. Every now and then, usually when I'm exhausted or distracted, I catch myself almost answering again. A noise in the trees that sounds close enough to be intentional. A rhythm that feels learned, not random. Each time I stop, I let the silence exist, because here's the lesson Big Cypress burned into me, the one that still steadies my hands when the night leans too close. You don't conquer the wild by being fearless. You survive it by being respectful. Fear keeps you alive when curiosity would get you killed. Silence keeps you unnoticed when confidence would make you visible. That night in the swamp, I didn't escape because I was brave. I escaped because the thing out there decided I wasn't finished yet. Or maybe because I finally understood, too late, that not everything wants to be understood. If you RV camp long enough, you'll feel it too. The moment when the environment stops being a backdrop and starts being an observer. When the land feels aware of you in a way that has nothing to do with imagination. When that happens, don't challenge it. Don't narrate it. Don't say your name out loud to prove you exist. Exist quietly. Let the night pass without learning you. Because somewhere, in places like Big Cypress, there are swamps that still remember the sound of my voice. Places where the frogs know when to stop. Places where water can move without sound. And if I've done one thing right since that night, it's this: I've never answered back again. The night didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. Like something vast had noticed us the moment we crossed into the Everglades and decided to keep pace. My name is Elliot Barnes. I was 38 that summer, and I had been living on the road long enough to believe I understood silence. I grew up in central Georgia, learned early how to sleep through cicadas and distant sirens, how to trust the rhythm of highways more than the rhythm of people. My vehicle then was a faded Volkswagen Westfalia, cream-colored once, now yellowed by sun and salt air. The kind of van that makes strangers nostalgic and makes you believe, falsely, that you're invisible. That night, it was just me, the hum of the engine, and I-75 stretching straight through the Everglades like a scar that never healed. I'd left Naples later than planned. Midnight crept up on me quietly, and by the time the dashboard clock flipped to 12:09 a.m., the road had emptied completely. No semis, no headlights coming the other way. Just darkness pressed flat on both sides by sawgrass and swamp water I couldn't see but could somehow feel like a cold breath against my ankles. That's when I noticed the hazard light. One amber blink, far ahead, off, on again. Perfectly timed. It hovered at the edge of my vision, centered in the lane, distant but constant. At first it felt comforting, a human signal, proof I wasn't alone out here. Someone else was driving slow, cautious, maybe broken down, but still trying to make it through the night. I adjusted my speed to catch up. The thing was, no matter how steadily I drove, the light never got closer. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The Westphalia's engine note stayed even, but my body leaned forward without my permission, as if proximity might be willed into existence. Every blink of that amber light felt like a heartbeat I was sinking to without realizing it. On, off, on, off. The Everglades pressed in tighter the longer I watched it. The air smelled wet and metallic like rusted water. I cracked my window for fresh air and immediately regretted it. Warmth rushed in, thick and heavy, carrying a faint rot that clung to the back of my throat. I rolled the window back up, sealed myself inside glass and steel, and told myself this was nothing. That was my pattern back then. Rationalize first. Feel later. I told myself the driver ahead was maintaining the same speed. I told myself depth perception gets weird at night. I told myself the swamp was playing tricks on me, turning distance elastic. The hazard light blinked again, unbothered by my reasoning. On. Off. The road signs came and went, mile markers sliding past like quiet witnesses. Everglades. No services. Next 30 miles. The letters reflected back at me in white bursts, then disappeared into the rear view, swallowed by dark. That's when I realized something else was wrong. There were no taillights, just the hazard blink, no red glow, no silhouette of a vehicle, just that single amber pulse suspended ahead of me like it wasn't attached to anything solid. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The vinyl was slick with humidity or sweat. I couldn't tell which. The Westfalia creaked softly as if responding to my tension, cabinets ticking with every subtle shift in the road. I slowed down. The hazard light slowed with me. I sped up. It stayed exactly where it was. A thought crept in then, quiet but insistent. You're not gaining on it because there's nothing to gain on. I laughed out loud to break the thought, the sound sharp and lonely in the van. Get a grip, I said to no one. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the darkness outside the windshield. Another mile passed, then another. The swamp seemed closer now, not physically, but emotionally, like it was leaning in, curious. I felt exposed on that road like the Westphalia's thin metal skin was nothing more than a suggestion of safety. And then suddenly the hazard light was gone, not faded, not blinked out, just gone. I lifted my foot off the accelerator without thinking. The van coasted forward, engine humming low. My eyes scanned the road ahead, searching for brake lights, a shoulder, anything that explained the disappearance. That's when I saw the guardrail. It wasn't where it should have been. A section of it was crushed inward, bent down toward the swamp like it had been grabbed and dragged. The reflective tape along its edge was torn, jagged, catching my headlights in broken flashes. I slowed to a crawl. The road surface changed there, dark streaks, long and uneven, cutting across the asphalt and disappearing over the edge. Drag marks, deep ones. Not the kind left by skidding tires, but by weight. Something heavy being pulled, resisting. My stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear yet. It was recognition. Some primitive part of me understood before my mind did that whatever happened here had not ended. I pulled onto the shoulder despite every instinct screaming not to stop. The Westphalia shuddered as I put it in park. For a moment, I just sat there, hands on the wheel, engine idling, listening. No insects, no frogs, no distant movement. The Everglades had gone unnaturally still. I stepped out of the van, and the heat wrapped around me like wet cloth. The smell was stronger here. Mud, decay, something faintly coppery. My boots crunched on gravel as I moved toward the guardrail, my flashlight cutting a narrow cone through the dark. The metal was twisted, still warm to the touch. That's what broke my denial. Metal doesn't stay warm at night unless something made it that way recently. I followed the drag marks with the beam of my light. They led straight through the crushed rail and down the embankment, vanishing into black water thick with floating grass. I didn't hear a splash. I didn't hear anything at all. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking halfway through the word. No answer. I stood there longer than I should have, staring into the swamp, convinced that if I listened hard enough, the night would explain itself. Instead, the silence pressed back, heavy and deliberate, like it was daring me to step closer. Then I heard it, a sound from the water. Slow, deliberate. Not a splash, more like something shifting its weight beneath the surface. The grass moved in a way that didn't match the breeze, parting gently, as if something large was easing forward. My flashlight beam shook. I told myself it was an alligator. This was Alligator Alley, after all. That explanation should have been enough. It wasn't, because as the grass parted wider, I saw something pale just beneath the surface, smooth, curved, catching the light for half a second before sinking again. Not scales, not hide. Paint. The same faded cream color as my Volkswagen. The realization hit me so hard I staggered back from the edge. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. The hazard light blinked again. Not ahead of me now, but behind, reflected faintly in the swamp water like an echo that hadn't realized it was supposed to stop. On. Off. I ran back to the van, heart slamming, hands fumbling with the door handle. As I climbed inside and slammed it shut, the smell followed me, swamp and rust and something else I couldn't name. The engine felt too loud when I turned the key, like it was announcing my presence to everything out there listening. As I pulled back onto the highway, my headlights swept once more across the crushed guardrail and the disturbed water beyond it. For just a moment, no longer than a blink, I thought I saw hands gripping the grass at the water's edge, pale and still, as if waiting for the road to come closer. I didn't look in the mirrors again until my eyes burned from forcing them forward. The road reclaimed me too easily. Asphalt smoothed out, lines returned to their proper places, and the Everglades slipped back into its posture of patient indifference, as if nothing had been disturbed at all. That normalcy was worse than panic. Panic would have justified stopping, turning around, screaming into the night. Normalcy made me doubt what I'd seen, and doubt is corrosive in places like this. The Westphalia rolled on, engine steady, tires whispering against pavement. I focused on that sound, clung to it like a metronome, keeping me anchored in reality. Every few seconds, my pulse tried to sync with something else, something slower, heavier, but I forced it back into rhythm with the van. The smell lingered. Not the general swamp smell that had faded once I closed the windows, but a faint, intrusive note of warm metal and stagnant water that shouldn't have been inside the vehicle at all. I told myself it was imagination, residue carried in on my clothes. I loosened my collar, wiped my palms on my jeans, and tried to breathe shallowly. Then the dashboard lights dimmed, not off, just dim like the van was exhaling. I tapped the dash with my knuckles. The lights brightened again, obedient, and I laughed under my breath, the sound brittle. "Electrical," I muttered. "You've always been temperamental." The Westphalia had quirks. Anyone who drove an old Volkswagen knew that. Wiring that behaved like it had moods, gauges that told the truth only when they felt like it. I had forgiven worse on previous trips. I could forgive this too. A mile marker passed another. The road stretched ahead, empty and obedient, until, without warning, the hazard light blinked again. Dead center in my lane. On. Off. My foot slammed the brake harder than I meant to. The van lurched, cabinets rattling, a cup tipping over in the sink. The light remained fixed ahead of me, exactly the same distance as before, as if my reaction had been anticipated. "No," I said, the word sharp and involuntary. "No, no." I checked the mirrors. Nothing behind me, no reflection of amber in the glass, just darkness folding in on itself. The hazard light blinked again. This time it felt closer, not in distance, but in intention, like it wasn't guiding me anymore. Like it was measuring me. I drove slower. The light slowed with me. I accelerated. It matched me. A creeping thought surfaced then, unwelcome and insistent. What if it isn't ahead of you? What if it's attached to you now? I shook my head hard enough to make my neck ache. "Stop it," I whispered. Saying it out loud was supposed to break the spiral. Instead, the words seemed to sink into the van's upholstery, absorbed and held. The temperature dropped, not dramatically, just enough to notice. The air inside the Westphalia cooled in uneven pockets, brushing my arms, my neck, like something passing too close without touching. Goosebumps rose along my skin. I checked the vents. They were closed. The road curved gently then, a rare bend in Alligator Alley, and for a brief, disorienting moment, the hazard light slid toward the shoulder instead of staying centered. Relief flickered in my chest. Perspective, I told myself. That's all this is. As I rounded the curve, my headlights illuminated something I hadn't seen before. A pull-off. Not marked, not paved, just a widening of gravel and dirt carved into the edge of the swamp, the kind of unofficial stop truckers sometimes used when they pushed too far. A reflective post stood crooked at its entrance, and tied to it, hanging limp and unmoving, was a strip of orange fabric. Hazard tape. The blinking light hovered just beyond it now, steady in its rhythm, as if waiting for me to notice the invitation. On. Off. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a headache blooming fast and deep. The rational part of my mind screamed to keep driving, to treat this like the hallucination it had to be. But another part, the older, quieter one, recognized the shape of a trap. Not a sudden snare, but a slow narrowing of options until only one choice felt available. The pull-off represented certainty. Stopping. Understanding. An end to motion, and I was so tired. The Everglades have a way of making fatigue feel earned, inevitable. The road's monotony seeps into your bones, convinces you that rest is the only reasonable response. My hands ached, my shoulders sagged. The idea of pulling over, of letting the van idle while I gathered myself, felt dangerously appealing. The hazard light blinked again. I turned into the pull-off before I could stop myself. Gravel popped under the tires, loud in the sudden quiet. The van rocked gently as I brought it to a stop. The hazard light, my hazard light, clicked on with a sound that felt too loud, too final. I hadn't touched the switch. The engine idled, then sputtered once as if clearing its throat. The headlights cast a wide cone over dirt, grass, and water beyond. The swamp lay inches from the edge, black and glassy, reflecting the van back at itself in warped fragments. I sat frozen, staring at my own reflection in the windshield. My face looked wrong. Drawn, pale, eyes too bright. Someone I didn't fully recognize stared back. The hazard light continued its steady rhythm. On, off. Something tapped the side of the van. Not a knock. Not an impact. Just a soft, exploratory tap, like a fingernail testing glass. I held my breath. Another tap. This one closer to the driver's door. My heart thudded so hard it made my vision pulse. I didn't want to look. Looking would make it real in a way denial still hadn't failed me completely. A third tap, lower now, near the wheel well. The smell intensified, flooding the cabin, swamp water and rust and something unmistakably human beneath it, like wet clothing left too long in a sealed bag. I tasted bile at the back of my throat. "Go away," I whispered, not knowing who or what I was addressing. The tapping stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left, heavy and expectant. I waited, muscles locked, listening for movement, for breath, for anything that proved I wasn't alone. Then I heard it from behind me. A dragging sound, slow, wet, methodical. It circled the van, staying just outside the reach of the headlights. I could track it by sound alone, the faint scrape of something heavy being pulled across gravel and grass. Every instinct I had told me not to turn, not to acknowledge it, not to invite whatever this was into my awareness. The hazard light blinked faster, on, off. My chest tightened. Air felt scarce, thick. I reached for the key, fingers trembling, and twisted it hard. The engine coughed. Once, twice. The dragging sound stopped. For a heartbeat, everything hung suspended. The van, the swamp, the blinking light, all of it balanced on a knife's edge. Then the engine roared to life, louder than it had any right to be, and the hazard lights shut off with a decisive click. I didn't wait. I threw the van into gear and floored it, gravel spraying, the rear fishtailing as I shot back onto the highway. The tires caught, the road straightened, and I was moving fast, leaving the pull-off, the swamp, and whatever had been circling me behind. In the rearview mirror, something pale retreated from the edge of the road, sliding back into darkness with a familiarity that chilled me deeper than fear ever could. As the miles stretched on and the first hints of distant traffic appeared, I realized my hands were numb, my jaw aching from how tightly I'd clenched it. The Everglades loosened its grip gradually, reluctantly, like it resented letting me go. But even as civilization crept closer, one thought stayed with me, heavy and unresolved. Whatever went into that swamp earlier, it hadn't been taken. It had followed. I didn't stop until I saw headlights that weren't mine. They appeared first as a glow on the horizon, then as defined beams cutting through the dark, approaching from the opposite direction. I felt my body respond before my mind did. My shoulders dropped an inch. My breathing loosened just enough to hurt. Civilization, even passing civilization, has weight. It presses back against whatever follows you in the dark. The hazard light never came back on. That absence should have comforted me. Instead, it left a hollow space in my awareness, like the silence after a ringing stops. Too clean, too sudden. I kept waiting for it to return, for the amber pulse to reassert itself in my peripheral vision, but the road stayed empty and obedient. I told myself it was over. I told myself that as the Everglades thinned and the swamp gave way to scrub, then to lights scattered low on the horizon. I told myself that as I crossed into Broward County and the radio crackled back to life with a late-night talk show host laughing at something I couldn't bring myself to hear. I told myself a lot of things that night. I pulled into a rest area just before 2 a.m., one of the larger ones with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a couple of semis idling like patient animals. The moment I put the van in park, my hands started shaking so badly I had to sit on them to make it stop. The smell was still there, fainter now, diluted by the rest area's sterile brightness, but unmistakable once I noticed it. Swamp water, rust, old, trapped air. It clung to the van's interior as if it had soaked into the fabric, into the foam beneath the cushions. I opened every window. I stepped outside and leaned against the side of the Westphalia, letting the cool concrete seep through my clothes. For the first time since Naples, I let myself feel how close I'd come to something unnamed and uncontained. A trucker glanced at me as he walked past, eyes lingering for half a second too long. "You all right, man?" he asked, casual but curious. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He accepted that the way strangers always do, grateful not to be invited deeper into someone else's night, and kept walking. I didn't sleep. I lay on the bench seat with my eyes open, watching the interior lights fade as my eyes adjusted, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Every sound made my muscles tense. The hiss of air brakes, the distant slam of a bathroom door, the flutter of paper caught in a breeze. At some point, exhaustion won. It didn't feel like drifting off. It felt like being pulled under. I dreamed of blinking lights reflected in black water, of metal bending like wet cardboard, of hands gripping grass, fingers digging in, refusing to let go. When I woke, dawn was just beginning to thin the darkness. Pale gray light crept through the windows, flattening shadows and softening edges. The smell was gone. I told myself that meant something. I drove the rest of the way to Fort Lauderdale in daylight, traffic thick and impatient, the road loud and familiar. The Everglades receded behind me, reduced to something manageable, something daylight could explain away. By the time I parked near the beach, the night felt distant, unreal, like a story I'd heard too young and misremembered. I stayed in the city for 3 days. I tried to reset, walked crowded sidewalks, ate in noisy diners, let the normal weight of human presence overwrite the isolation of Alligator Alley. I even laughed once, surprised by the sound of it. On the 4th morning, I decided to head north. I didn't think about the route until I was already packing up, until the map app recalculated and highlighted the fastest option in bright, confident blue. I-75. My stomach tightened, but I dismissed it. Fear only has power if you feed it, I told myself. Avoidance gives meaning to things that don't deserve it. I had made it through once. I could do it again. I merged onto the highway just after sunset. The road looked different in the opposite direction. Familiar, but reversed, like a sentence read backward. The Everglades greeted me with the same heavy air, the same endless stretch of darkness on either side. I kept my speed steady, eyes forward, refusing to search for what I didn't want to find. For a while, it worked. Then the radio cut out. Not gradually, instantly. One moment the host was mid-sentence, the next there was nothing but static. I reached for the dial, twisted it back and forth. The static persisted, thick and uneven, rising and falling like breath. I shut it off. Silence settled in, deeper now because I'd invited it. That's when I noticed the reflection, not ahead of me, in the windshield, a faint amber glow pulsing softly against the glass, as if something behind me was being reflected forward by the angle of the light. My chest tightened. I checked the mirrors. Nothing. The glow blinked again. On. Off. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the van. I followed the reflection down, heart hammering, until my eyes landed on the dashboard. The hazard light indicator was blinking. I hadn't touched it. Cold spread through me, sharp and immediate. No, I said, louder this time, anger edging out fear. You don't get to do this again. I reached out and flipped the switch down hard. The indicator kept blinking. On. Off. The smell returned all at once, flooding the cabin, thick enough to make my eyes water. The temperature dropped again, more pronounced this time, breath ghosting faintly in front of my face. Then I felt it. Wait. The van settled slightly, suspension compressing as if someone or something had climbed into the back. The cabinets creaked. A cushion shifted behind me with a sound too deliberate to be road vibration. I didn't turn around. I stared at the road ahead, knuckles white on the wheel, heart pounding so hard I thought it might split my ribs. My mind raced through explanations. Mechanical failure, stress, imagination, but each one fell apart before it finished forming. The weight shifted again. Closer. I smelled wet fabric, old water, something that had been submerged and dragged free. You don't belong here, I said, voice shaking but firm. I didn't know who I was talking to. I only knew I had to say something that wasn't fear. The hazard light blinked faster. On, off, on, off. A sound came from the back then. Not a voice, not quite, but a strained, wet exhale, like lungs remembering how to work after too long without air. It carried grief more than threat, desperation more than anger. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't hunting me. It was lost. Panic gave way to something else then, something heavier, sadder. The realization didn't make the fear disappear, but it changed its shape. Whatever had gone into that swamp hadn't been taken by the Everglades. It had never left the road. I can't help you, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. I don't know how. The weight shifted one last time, then eased away, the van lifting subtly as if relieved of a burden. The smell thinned, the temperature rose. The hazard indicator blinked twice more, then went dark. I drove the rest of the way north without incident. I sold the Westphalia 2 months later. I didn't tell the buyer why. I just said it was time for something new. Sometimes letting go is the only way to make sure something doesn't follow you any further. I still think about Alligator Alley when I drive at night, about how roads don't just carry the living from place to place. They remember the unfinished journeys, the moments where motion stopped but intention didn't. And whenever I see a lone hazard light blinking on an empty highway, I slow down. Not out of fear, but out of respect. I thought selling the van would be enough. For a while, it was. Life has a way of smoothing itself back into something livable when you give it time and daylight. I moved inland, took a job that kept me off the highways after dark, traded long, empty roads for predictable routines and early mornings. I stopped telling the story, even to myself, because stories grow teeth when you keep feeding them. Months passed, then a year. The Everglades became something abstract again, just a green stretch on a map, just a place people joked about when they talked about Florida. I let myself believe that whatever had happened on Alligator Alley had been bound to that road, to that van, to that specific convergence of fatigue and isolation. I let myself believe I'd closed the loop. Then, one night, I was driving home from work just after midnight. Different state, different road, a 2-lane highway cutting through pine flats, the kind of place where darkness still feels earned. The radio played low, some old song I half remembered, and my thoughts were mercifully ordinary. Groceries, emails, the quiet relief of being almost home. That's when I saw it. A single hazard light ahead. Amber. Steady. Patient. It wasn't doing anything wrong. It wasn't hovering unnaturally or keeping impossible distance. It was just there, blinking on the shoulder, attached to a dark shape that might have been a sedan or might have been nothing at all. My body reacted before my mind did. My foot eased off the accelerator, my hands tightened on the wheel, my heart rate picked up. Not racing, just alert, like an animal lifting its head at a familiar sound. I could have driven past. That would have been the safer choice, the easier one. The one that let me pretend respect meant distance, that acknowledgement was enough. But the road was empty. The night was still, and something inside me, something shaped by Alligator Alley, understood that some lights aren't warnings. They're requests. I slowed and pulled over several car lengths behind the blinking amber. I left my headlights on. I stayed in my seat. I didn't approach. I didn't call out. I just waited. The hazard light blinked. On. Off. The air outside my car felt heavier than it should have, but not hostile. There was no smell this time, no sudden cold, no sense of weight shifting behind me, just the quiet presence of something unresolved sharing the same stretch of pavement. "I see you," I said softly, not even sure I was speaking aloud. The words felt important, not as an invitation, but as recognition. The hazard light blinked twice in quick succession. Then it shut off. The shoulder was empty. No drag marks, no disturbed grass, no sign that anyone or anything had ever been there at all. I sat for a long moment, hands steady, breath slow. Whatever that had been, it didn't follow me. It didn't need to. The exchange had been complete. I drove the rest of the way home under a sky just beginning to pale at the edges, thinking about roads and the quiet agreements we make with them without realizing it. About how movement doesn't always mean escape and stopping doesn't always mean danger. Somewhere out there on stretches of asphalt most people rush through without thinking, there are moments that never quite finished happening. Lights that blink because someone once needed to be seen, because something went wrong and never got acknowledged. Alligator Alley taught me that fear isn't always about being chased. Sometimes it's about being noticed. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do on an empty highway at night is slow down, not to intervene, not to fix what can't be fixed, but to bear witness. To let the road know that what happened on it mattered, that the last light didn't blink for nothing. I don't camp anymore. I don't drive through the Everglades after dark, but when I'm alone on the road and I see that amber pulse ahead of me, steady and patient against the black, I listen. The first thing that night took from me wasn't my sense of safety. It was my certainty that the river followed the rules I thought it did. My name is Caleb Monroe, and I was 38 years old the night the Suwannee decided to remind me how thin the line is between drifting and being dragged. I'd been RV camping most of my adult life, 20 years of campgrounds, state parks, river bends, and forgotten access roads. I grew up in North Florida, learned the water young, learned how to read weather by smell, learned when the woods were settling down for the night and when they were holding their breath. I trusted those instincts, or at least I thought I did. That week, I was camped just off a quiet stretch of the Suwannee River, where the trees lean inward like they're listening to secrets pass beneath the surface. The campground was barely a campground at all, just a gravel loop, a few wooden docks, and long slips meant for houseboats that didn't come through much anymore. My RV sat backed up near the water, nose angled toward the trees, rear facing the river. The air smelled like wet leaves and old iron, the kind of smell that sticks in your throat if you breathe too deeply. I was alone. That part matters. I'd told myself I wanted solitude. Truth was, I needed distance from people, from noise, from a year that had taken more than it gave. When you live on the road long enough, you start believing you can outrun the things that weigh you down, that if you keep moving, the past loses its grip. That night, the river proved how wrong that belief really was. It was early evening when I noticed the houseboat the first time. I was sitting outside, folding up a camp chair, watching the sun sink into the trees. The river was slow, glassy in places, broken by lazy ripples where fish surfaced. Then the boat came into view, large, square-bodied, painted white once upon a time, but now yellowed and streaked with algae stains. Every light on it was on, cabin lights, deck lights, even a soft glow from inside the pilot house. No engine noise. It drifted past the dock without a soul in sight. I remember standing there, chair half folded, feeling a flicker of confusion slide through me. Houseboats don't drift like that. Not with the lights on. Not without someone aboard. They don't just pass through. I told myself someone was asleep inside, or drunk, or anchored upstream and had slipped loose. All reasonable explanations. The kind you cling to because they let you stay comfortable. The boat moved downstream, slow and steady, carried by the current, disappearing around a bend where the trees swallowed it whole. The river returned to its quiet. Cicadas picked back up, frogs started their low, throaty chorus. I went back inside the RV and made dinner. That should have been the end of it. An hour later, I stepped back outside to rinse a pan at the water spigot, and my stomach tightened so suddenly I had to grab the side of the RV to steady myself. The houseboat was coming back. Upstream, against the current. The same lights burned, the same quiet, no engine, no wake, just the slow, deliberate movement of something that shouldn't have been moving at all. I felt stupid standing there, staring, trying to convince myself my eyes were lying. The Suwannee doesn't reverse. Boats don't undo their own paths. And yet there it was, sliding toward the dock like it had somewhere specific to be. It didn't tie up. It didn't stop. It drifted past again, close enough now that I could see details I hadn't before. Curtains drawn inside, a coffee mug on a counter, a deck chair tipped over as if someone had stood up too fast and never come back to right it. Still no people. When it vanished upstream, the night felt different, thicker, like the air had taken on weight. I checked my watch without meaning to. 9:41 p.m. That was the first moment unease crept in, not panic, not fear. Just a quiet, persistent feeling that something had shifted and I hadn't been part of the decision. I locked the RV door. I told myself it was nothing. Rivers carry strange things. Boats break loose. The mind fills in gaps when it wants patterns. I showered. I sat on the dinette and read a few pages of a book I couldn't focus on. Every few minutes I paused, listening. The river has a sound when it moves at night. A low, continuous hush like breath through teeth. That night, beneath it, I heard something else. A dull, irregular tap. Not wood on wood, not metal. Something heavier, deeper. I told myself it was debris. At 10:32 p.m., the dock creaked. I froze mid-step. The creak came again, slow and deliberate, the sound of weight being placed and shifted. I killed the lights inside the RV and moved to the window, easing the curtain aside just enough to see. The houseboat was tied up at the far end of the dock. No ropes, no lines thrown, just there. Its lights were brighter now, reflecting off the water in long, trembling streaks. I waited for a door to open, for a figure to appear, for anything that would explain why my skin had started to prickle like static. Nothing happened. Minutes passed. The dock stopped creaking. That's when I smelled it. Not river rot, not algae. Something sour and cold like stagnant water trapped too long in a closed space. It seeped through the screen windows, settled in the back of my throat, made my eyes sting. I remember thinking of all the times I'd ignored my instincts before, times I'd waved off discomfort because it was inconvenient, because fear felt embarrassing, because leaving meant admitting something was wrong. At 10:56 p.m., the RV rocked. Not a sway, not a shift from wind, a solid upward bump from beneath like something large had pressed against the hull and released. I grabbed the table, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my jaw. The bump came again, harder this time, followed by a slow scrape along the underside of the RV. My breath came shallow, each inhale tasting like metal and river water. Then I saw it. A wet handprint pressed against the cabin window beside the door. The fingers were long. Too long. Water streamed down from the palm, leaving thin trails that caught the light from inside. And then, slowly, it began to slide upward, dragging moisture across the glass as if whoever or whatever was outside was pulling itself higher. I stood there, unable to move, every rational thought collapsing under the weight of what I was seeing as the handprint reached the top edge of the window and paused. The handprint stayed there, pressed flat against the glass, as if it was listening to me breathe. I didn't scream. I didn't move. My body went rigid in a way I'd only ever felt once before, years earlier, when a tree fell across a road just seconds after I passed through. That same cold clarity washed over me, the kind where your thoughts don't race, they narrow, where every unnecessary idea is stripped away, leaving only what matters for survival. The fingers twitched. Just slightly. Water continued to drip down the window, slow and rhythmic, each drop sounding louder than it should have in the tight space of the RV. I became painfully aware of every sound my body made, the thud of my heartbeat in my ears, the soft whistle of air through my nose, the faint creak of the RV settling on its suspension. The handprint slid again. Upward. Then stopped. Something scraped along the exterior wall, a dragging sound like wet fabric or skin pulling against metal. The smell intensified, flooding the RV now, thick and suffocating, carrying a hint of decay that turned my stomach. I tasted bile and swallowed it back down, afraid even that small movement might give me away. I told myself, no, I begged myself to think logically. Someone had fallen in the river. Someone had tried to grab onto the RV. Someone was injured, panicked, desperate. But the river doesn't lift people upward like that. And desperation sounds different. It thrashes, it splashes, it pleads. This was deliberate, slow, patient. The scraping moved toward the door. I eased my hand toward the cabinet where I kept a small hatchet. Not a weapon, just a tool I'd used 100 times to split kindling. My fingers brushed the handle, slick with sweat, as another bump hit the RV, this one lower, heavier, like a shoulder pressing in. The door handle rattled once. Just once, not pulled, not yanked, tested. My lungs burned as I realized I'd stopped breathing. Outside, the dock creaked again, the sound of weight-shifting boards, then footsteps. Wet. Heavy. Coming from the direction of the houseboat. That's when the truth I'd been avoiding finally broke through. Whatever was out there hadn't come from the water alone. It had been on that houseboat, and now it had crossed the dock. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. Silence followed, thick and suffocating, stretching so long my mind started filling it with imagined movement. I stared at the door, waiting for the handle to turn again, for the deadbolt to strain, for the thin barrier between me and the night to fail. Instead, something brushed against the side of the RV, slow and dragging, like fingers trailing along the metal skin. The sound moved toward the front, then paused. A shadow passed across the small window by the dinette, tall, misshapen, its outline warped by the glass and darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, forcing myself to think. Panic would get me killed. I needed distance, light, noise. Anything that broke the control this thing seemed to have over the moment. I flicked on the exterior floodlight. The sudden burst of white light flooded the campsite, throwing harsh shadows across the dock and riverbank. I braced myself for what I'd see through the window. There was nothing there, no figure, no wet footprints, no sign of movement. The dock was empty. The houseboat sat at the far end, lights still burning, its reflection trembling in the disturbed water. The river itself looked wrong now, ripples spreading outward in uneven circles as if something large had just submerged and moved away. I stood there, light buzzing overhead, heart pounding so hard my vision pulsed with it. The rational part of my mind clawed back control, flooding me with explanations I wanted desperately to believe. An animal, maybe. A manatee. A bear. A drunk swimmer playing some sick joke. But animals don't test door handles, and jokes don't smell like rot. I grabbed my keys, phone, and flashlight, shoving them into my pockets. I didn't bother with shoes. The need to leave pressed in on me from all sides, overriding everything else. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the light. The night air hit me like a wall, cooler now, heavy with river mist. My bare feet slapped against damp gravel as I scanned the ground. There were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest anyone, or anything, had been standing there moments ago. I moved closer to the dock, each step measured, ears straining. The houseboat loomed larger now, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. I could see more clearly inside, furniture undisturbed, a jacket hanging over a chair, condensation streaking the glass from within. It looked lived in. Recently. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking despite my effort to keep it steady. "Is anyone there?" The word echoed across the water and died without an answer. I climbed onto the dock, the boards slick beneath my feet. They groaned softly, a sound that made my skin crawl now. Halfway down, the smell returned, stronger, clinging to the air around the houseboat like a fog. I stopped 10 feet away, flashlight beams sweeping across the deck. That's when I noticed the ladder. It hung down the side of the houseboat, partially submerged, water dripping steadily from its rungs. And wrapped around the lowest rung was something dark. Long strands of hair, tangled and matted, swaying gently with the movement of the river. My stomach dropped. I backed away, breath coming fast now, panic finally breaking through the dam I'd built. My foot slipped on the wet board and I stumbled, catching myself on a piling. The water beside the dock rippled, not outward, inward, as if something below had just changed direction. I turned and ran. I didn't care about noise anymore. I didn't care about dignity. I sprinted back to the RV, slammed the door behind me, and threw the deadbolt so hard it rattled in its frame. The RV rocked again, harder this time. Something struck the underside repeatedly now, thump, scrape, thump, like fists or shoulders colliding with metal. Cabinets rattled. A cup fell from the counter and shattered, the sound sharp and final. I dropped to the floor, clutching the hatchet, every nerve screaming. Through the chaos, another sound rose, water sloshing against the RV's steps, wet footsteps ascending, slow, heavy. They stopped at the door. A voice came next, low, gurgling, almost human. "Help me." The words dragged, distorted as if forced through water-filled lungs. My chest tightened painfully, grief and fear tangling together. That was the cruelest part. Not the violence, not the threat, but the way it reached for something deep inside me, the part that wanted to help, the part that still believed people deserved compassion. I stayed silent. The voice tried again, closer to the window now. "Please." A wet smear appeared on the glass, followed by the same handprint as before. This time, the skin looked bloated, pale beneath the light, veins dark and branching like cracks in ice. I crawled backward until my spine hit the wall, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. I didn't know how long it would keep trying. I didn't know if the door would hold. I didn't know if morning would come in time. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. No footsteps, no scraping, no voice, only the river. I waited, counting my breaths, muscles burning from tension. Minutes passed, maybe more. The silence stretched, brittle and unnatural. Finally, I dared to look out the window again. The houseboat was drifting away, untied, unmanned, lights still on. It moved slowly upstream against the current, disappearing into the darkness exactly the way it had before. I stayed awake until dawn, every light on, engine running, ready to drive the moment the sun touched the trees. I left that campsite at first light and never looked back. Even now, years later, I don't camp near quiet rivers, I don't trust empty boats, and when the water smells wrong, when it carries that cold, sour edge, I listen, because some places don't let go of what they take, and sometimes they drift back. I didn't sleep after that, not even for a minute. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling, headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the trees, my hands locked around the steering wheel until my fingers went numb. Every sound made me flinch. The tick of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through Spanish moss, the distant splash of something surfacing far out on the river. Each noise felt intentional now, like the night itself was aware I was still there. The sky eventually began to pale, not with warmth, but with exhaustion. Dawn didn't arrive like a promise. It crept in slowly, reluctantly, peeling shadows away inch by inch. The trees looked thinner in daylight, less like sentinels and more like witnesses that had already seen too much to care. When the sun finally breached the horizon, I put the RV in gear and pulled out without checking the mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 20 miles away, one of those old ones with flickering fluorescent lights and a clerk who didn't ask questions. I parked under the brightest light I could find and just sat there, shaking, while my body caught up to what my mind had already accepted. I kept smelling it, the rot, the stagnant cold, even though the air around me was clean. I scrubbed my hands in the restroom sink until my knuckles burned, but the sensation wouldn't leave. It wasn't on my skin, it was in my memory now. For weeks afterward, I told myself it was a freak event, a convergence of strange but explainable things, a drifting boat, an animal, a trick of fear amplified by isolation and fatigue. That lie worked until it didn't. A month later, back home, I searched for news, missing persons, accidents on the Suwannee, abandoned vessels. I didn't expect to find anything. I almost hoped I wouldn't, but I did. A small article buried deep in a local paper's archive, 2 years old, easy to miss. A family-owned houseboat had gone missing upriver during a storm. 3 people aboard, no distress call, no wreckage, just gone. Locals speculated it broke loose and sank somewhere in the bends where the current turns unpredictable and the water runs dark and deep. One line stuck with me, curling into my thoughts like a hook. The boat was later spotted drifting several times over the following months, always unmanned, always lit. No recoveries were ever made. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of the truth pressing down on me harder than fear ever had. Because what haunted me most wasn't the idea of something unnatural, it was the idea of something unfinished. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about why that night shook me so deeply, why it still creeps into my thoughts when I park near water, why I check reflections before I check locks, why I trust my instincts faster now, without apology. It's because I realized something I'd been running from for years. RV camping, for all its freedom, teaches you a dangerous lie if you're not careful. The idea that you're in control just because you're mobile. That if you can leave, you're safe. That nature is a backdrop, not a participant. That night on the Suwannee stripped that illusion away. The river wasn't hostile. It wasn't malicious. It didn't chase me. It simply didn't care. And whatever had been clinging to that houseboat, whatever had pressed its hand against my window, felt like a reminder of that truth. Not a monster hunting, but an echo refusing to sink, a presence caught between motion and stillness, between drifting and returning. I think about the voice sometimes. Help me. Not screamed, not demanded, offered like a test. That's the part people don't understand when they ask why I didn't open the door, why I didn't try to help. Because real danger doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it wears familiarity, sometimes it borrows your empathy, sometimes it knows exactly which part of you to touch to make you doubt your own survival instincts. I learned that night that listening to your gut isn't cowardice, it's memory. It's every warning passed down through generations of people who learned, often too late, that the wild doesn't negotiate. I still camp, I still travel. The road is still part of who I am, but I choose my places differently now. I don't stay near water that smells wrong. I don't ignore quiet when it feels heavy instead of peaceful. And I never assume an empty vessel is truly empty, whether it's a houseboat, a campsite, or a moment in my own life that looks calm on the surface but carries weight beneath. Because some things don't sink when they should. Some things drift. And some things come back. That's the lesson the Suwannee gave me. Not through fear alone, but through the kind of understanding that only comes when you realize how close you came to becoming part of a story someone else would whisper about later. A lighted boat on a dark river, an unanswered knock, a handprint that kept climbing, and a man who learned just in time that survival sometimes means knowing when not to open the door.